That's a signal, is it?
Mm. Good morning, friends. Today in meeting, we have an interesting topic. Friend Gordon Purdy is going to speak on national service. Gordon.
Well, it is rather odd for a Quaker-based group to be discussing this, but it was something that was contributed in a recent meeting for worship. So when I thought about it, there are things perhaps worth considering. I haven't really thought much about it myself, but whenever I do, I look back and think how fortunate I was to go through my national service, and I've never regretted it. Perhaps if I'd been a Quaker at that time, I might have had some second thoughts about it, but no, not at all. It's been for me very good. Of course, that may be just because the process that met needs I had at the time and may not have anything outside, but perhaps one or two of you have been through it and can add to it, and we can always ask, see what people think. As I say, when I think back, it was so very important to me. Um, Oddly enough, now I've been thinking about it, I just realised now women weren't required, or if they were, it's something I didn't know nothing about. It was, as you may know, it was national service was really a hang-on from the end of the fighting of the last war, um, and of course the trouble doesn't stop when the war and fighting ends. Uh, Germany was in a complete mess and had to be held firm while they picked themselves up again. And there were also fighting going on in Malaya, in Korea. We were still being asked for more soldiers. So in what would it be? Well, 1954, just coming to the end of my schooling, I got the letter from the War Office asking me to apply, respond anyway. At the time, my father was working abroad and he was in Malaya, and my mother had just been given the opportunity of joining him for 3 months. And uh, I had then two sisters and a brother, and I thought at that time it would be as well as if I could defer it. It was possible after my university time. So that's what happened, and I spent 4 years at university, and at the end I came out not very happy about what had gone on, and I got the second invitation, and I was told to go for a medical. Oh, I could have opted out. At that time, national service was beginning to be wound up, and I could have opted out if I was going to be a teacher. And as far as I had any ambition at all at the time, it was never to be a teacher. No question, I went. So the War Office asked me to for a medical, and then asked me which of the parts of the military I would prefer, RAFs, Navy, or the Army. Well, I knew at the time that the RAF made it possible to run courses in Russian and Chinese. And I thought, that would be great if I could add to my few academic assets. So I said RAF. And they wrote back and said I was going in the army, and which particular unit of the army would be suitable for me. I knew about the education corps, so I applied for the education corps. And they wrote back and say I was going into the Royal Artillery, and I had to turn up at Oswestry on a particular date. I go through that simply to show what a kind of monster, how bureaucracy can be, and the questions that shouldn't have been put to me at all in a way, but they were. And looking back over many years since, I begin to wonder that it's not just the bureaucracy that was at work, but there are other influences in life which direct in particular directions, which work well for you. And as I say, I've never regretted my time, doing this, going through this. I was told to report, as I say, to Oswestry on a particular date. So when I travelled up by train, I could see there were others on the same wavelength, and we got to, well, I think it was Gobbo. Interestingly enough, last night I was watching a traffic incident in Oswestry, and it reminded me Park Hall. That's where I was posted, and that's where I spent the next 10 weeks. So we all arrived, we were met at the station, taken by truck to the camp, and it was a hectic few days. I can't remember all that went on, but certainly one of the first things that happened was our photographs were taken, and more important, we were all given a number, and that's who we were, 2358599. I can still recite it, I've had to say it so many times. But we had severe haircuts. We had a medical where I remember standing in line with my left arm on my hip and the arm above bare while a medic went along sticking the same syringe into everybody's arm. Nobody explained what this was for, but it was a part of this machine we were in. We had to go and collect all the uniforms, boots, and so on, and different outfits too. There's a sort of working outfit, a denims outfit, and a more sort of outgoing thing you paraded in, uniform you paraded in. We were taken to, we were divided and taken into two huts where we met a low-ranking non-commissioned officer who made it plain that his job was to make us more afraid of him than of the enemy. And we set about, we were told how to make beds and how they were to be made up in the morning in the right way for the inspection that came around then. It looked ridiculous at the time, but the bedding had to have this dead folded over and had this dead straight line. And this would be picked up at the inspection the next day. We soon got to know, well, I soon got to know just what a mixed bunch I was in. I remember a comic character whose job was to drive delivery trucks full of casks of beer to the pubs around the country. There was a couple of lads from Sheffield Steelworks. They seemed to be friends. They both played rugby league. Tough, completely people I'd never met the like before. There was a guy who apparently made his living shooting ducks illegally in the marshes, and I think it would be in Sussex. There was even a member of my college who had never spoken to me at college and has never done so since. So, this was odd. We also found out very early that we learned to be wise after a while. The NCO would come in and ask them if anybody had got an O-level, and put your hand up, right, go and clean the latrines. What it might be, can you play a piano? We learned better. But as a result of all that, I realized I was the only one in this hut, both with an A-level and no criminal count, So I say a very, very mixed bunch. And we had to respond pretty quickly to anything we were told. I think it's important to say that at the time I was physically a weed. My schooling had been so disturbed over so many years that I'd never played games much, and my only assets, if there were assets, were academic. But 2 or 3 days into our landing, we were into the gym to do work, and I remember one day, it might have been the first day or the next, we went in and found that the instructor had laid out an assault course for us to get round, things to climb over and under and up and down and so on. And we barely started when he suddenly shouted that we were to stop. And he ordered us, everybody up, to hang on the wall bars, just reach the wall bar and hang loose. And then he turned to me and said, "Not you." Then he turned to the guys on the wall bars and asked them to stick out their legs. When we were satisfied, he turned to me with a grin and said, "They're going to hang their suffering until you've been round there once." It was really embarrassing. But surprising thing was, it didn't make the others dislike me or whatever. I mean, part of the whole process was to make us a team and dependent on each other. And we were forever encouraging each other to do the impossible things we were asked to do. There would be, one days when we were sent to prepare the dinner, the meals, or another day when we were asked to clean bits of the camp or whatever, different sort of jobs for us to be occupied with. But of course, the main thing was the routine of parading on the ground. As we were a regiment which dealt with vehicles and guns, we didn't have to do much infantry work. It was more just, getting our strength up. There were other things I can recall, but we did this, for 10 weeks marching. Oh yes, we had rather embarrassing. I mean, embarrassing to say, it certainly wasn't body fitting pants and shirts to do things like gym. And there were days when, to amuse themselves, the instructor or the NCO who was in charge of us would have us march down the road a little to the outside the hospital, where all the nurses knew we would see us, and made to do all kinds of stupid things just to entertain them. It was a case of, I think, very often just being able to respond to ridiculous things, unpredictable things, and without thinking about it. And I think that was certainly true by the time I'd finished my 10 weeks. Then, at the end of that time, we were all separated and sent to various areas where we would be needed, where there were, short of recruits. It says something for that training that at the end of that time, I was proposed by the major that I should try the WOSB, the War Office Selection Board scheme, which chose officers. Though he did say, as I was going, that he didn't think much of me, but they were pretty desperate, so they were sending me along. Astonishingly enough, I had learned enough to go through this process. That was very interesting, physically and intellectually. There was one bit, we worked as a team very often, or tried to work as a team, but there was the important bit was being taken around by one officer, just with each of us. And you were taken to various things you were asked to do. And it says something for me at the time. I couldn't do it now. I couldn't think of doing it now, never mind, couldn't do it. I remember a wall built of railway sleepers, wooden railway sleepers, with the top had a strip of paint on it, and in the center was a hole, and the hole was, well, I didn't think it was very wide. It certainly had a paint around the edges, and my task was to get over the wall without touching any of the paint. and I really couldn't jump over it. The only thing was to try and dive through it. And as I say, my reactions were then, I just did it. I can't remember whether I actually got through. There was another object where I was invited to jump over a sand pit. And there were, well, not jump over it, to get myself over it without getting inside. And there were bits of timber and rope and bits of metal that I could use to get through it. And I looked at this, and I looked at the pit, and I realized I could jump over it, which I did. And there was very searching. And then I was sent off for officer training. And I don't want to say too much about that now, because everybody's experience of that bit of the service would be different. For me, it was a great time. I mean, things I certainly couldn't have hoped to go through outside the army. And perhaps I just leave it there, because it's anything that might have interest elsewhere. My own needs, pleasures were not so certain. So I'll leave it to you if you have anything particular to ask. Go ahead and see if we can begin a discussion out of that.
I wanted to ask about the boots. You know, when you were given your army uniform at the beginning, did you get new boots, or did you have to have used boots?
Oh no, they were new boots. And what's more, one was for general wear, and the other was for big inspection parades, special occasions. And they, both had to be cleaned every night until they were shiny. But the special boots had to be carefully polished with, finger and floor and boot polish. And by rubbing it gently all over, you could produce the most amazing gloss on the end. And that was for a special show. I haven't mentioned much to the fact that we were taught to look after ourselves. We were given, in those macho days, what was called a housewife, which was a bag full of needles and threads and bits of wool and the like, and we were expected, to do our own sewing and repairing, which I did. And I was rather sorry when in civilian life, when woolen socks didn't produce the holes that they used to, because I got quite good at repairing the holes.
Ray?
Yeah, Mary.
Gordon, were you required to utter any oath of allegiance or anything of that sort?
Well, it's good that you ask, because I think part of the course was definitely to make us think only of our country. We knew we represented our country. We didn't even think about it. But we weren't asked, as the Americans were, to swear fealty to the king or whatever, or queen, of course. No, it was just assumed. And I was grateful for it. I mean, I felt you were doing something for, your colleague, your country. You could have a discussion about patriotism, because there's much to be said for it as against.
What do you think? I mean, I was born in 1944, so I was brought up with the idea. Well, it wasn't so much the idea, the total acceptance, and it being part of my wisdom as I grew up. Patriotism, I just, it was just there, and I didn't start to question it too much later on.
Sorry, I was just there. I'm deaf partly. I can't see everything.
Oh no, that's okay. Yeah, I'm interested in the patriotism, because when as I grew up, patriotism wasn't so much talk
Sorry, I
to
still can't catch that word.
Oh, patriotism?
Oh, patriotism. I'm sorry. Yes.
Sorry. No, it's just that I kind of grew up with patriotism being kind of sewn into the fabric of life. It wasn't so much you thought about it, it was just there because it was just after the war.
Patsy, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you make sure he can lip read you, because that matters tremendously if you're hard of hearing?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just hold your head up, Patsy.
It's only occasionally,
Oh,
but
yes,
it's usually
yeah.
the key word that goes.
Sorry. Yes. I'm wondering whether you think that patriotism has been replaced by something else today.
I think it's been dissolved. I remember at school being taught the song and a wonderful tune to it. I vow to thee, my country, all earthly things above, and so on.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yes, and so on.
Yes. Angela, are you?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I can remember since I lived in the United States for several years, I lived and worked in Botswana for several years, that my passport made me a subject, not a citizen. That used to really, really rile me. I am very proud that my most recent passport, at long last, of this country, I am a citizen.
Yes.
And no, I will not be chanting allegiance tomorrow
No,
to Charlie 3. Absolutely not. But
No.
seriously, my then husband, my first husband, was he did an apprenticeship as a chef in a hotel called the Connaught Hotel, which was 5 stars. And so when he did his national service, he wanted to go into the Air Force. So he had no choice. He went to headquarters in High Wycombe so that he could cook the officers the most wonderful food. The good thing for us, I mean, the difficulty for us, there was an American Air Force unit and a British Air Force unit in High Wycombe. And so the rented accommodation was absolutely awful. We lived in a single room, and the owners had an Alsatian dog. And if I wanted to get up in the night to go to wee, this dog would practically bar my way. So, yeah. But, as a chef, he had a good time. I mean, he had to cook high quality meals. If there were leftovers, nobody wanted them, so he took them home. He was allowed to, because if you don't do what you're allowed to do in the Air Force or any of the other forces, you would be in dead trouble. But we had the most wonderful meals left over from the elite Air Force. I just want to say again, when my dad joined up the army, I was born in 1939. He was asked his religion and he said atheist. And they wrote down, after quite a tussle, Church of England, which my dad thought was absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
So that's my background.
Gordon, there was an amazing social mix, wasn't there? Can you comment on that?
Yes, well, I say we came from very, very different backgrounds, and it was just accepted. And I think that was it was one of the important things that I experienced there. And there I was with people from. I mean, I was hopeless physically. I was nothing when I started, yet very much at home with the others. I was never made fun of, or it was good.
Did you eventually become a captain?
No, I started with 1 pip per lieutenant, and when I left, I was given 2 pips, which meant that I was liable to be called up for several years after that. I remember I did, at the end of what I thought was the time, I wrote back and said, I'm glad to say we won't be doing. And they said, no, we just changed it. We made it a few years further on. So I'd always been liable.
May I say a question which is maybe on the reverse of that is, when did you become a friend?
Well, that's a story in itself, but I didn't actually, I Tinder for a long time, and I still, and in those the days, that would be in the early 70s, I think, when I was working in London. And I really, at the time, there was, of course, what do they call them? Birthright friends, and then ordinary friends and attenders. And I thought, well, you know, attenders is all you need, really.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand. But I did become a member when I was, many years later, well, I applied for a post as teaching in China, in a Chinese medical university where there was a Quaker connection. And I thought it would be simple then, though I didn't really think, if I applied to become a member, simply to be able to say to the Chinese why. Interestingly enough, we were taught then, nothing to do with the army, but we were taught then not to make known your religious behavior to the Chinese. What was interesting, many of them, students, would come and ask me about it. But that's another tale.
We have another friend who here at the moment who was in China teaching, Angela.
Oh yes, yes, I saw that some time ago, wasn't it?
Well, I was teaching for the University of Huddersfield. I was teaching Chinese undergraduate students who were doing a Bachelor of Education degree, very similar to the one they would have done in if they'd come to Huddersfield. And they were absolutely amazing in the languages they spoke and so on. Well, and they had to write 2,000 words essays in English.
Yes.
And the most impressive of them got first-class honours degrees. So yeah, that's sort of, I think I'm talking about that in a couple of weeks or
right, I've seen that.
Yeah.
Gordon, what role did a padre take?
Well, there were padres. I can't say I ever met one. Yes, I knew. I suppose at the time I did wonder about this, the sort of religious approval of what was going on in the army. But I suppose that aspect was, brings in patriotism again. What do you believe in, whether you did or not.
That's king and country. I
That's
said king and country in Ratlock.
Yes, king and country. Well, queen and country, of course.
Queen and country. That's my elder brother, who is now 80. Wow, I just remembered that. Well, was called up in that type of thing, and he went into the infantry, and he said he found it different because before going in, he was a big hairy biker type of thing, who was a bit of a rebel, and being as you said, to being all this all together and marching around like anything, he found, very strange.
I must say, marching marching to a band is a very interesting experience. You belong. You feel, it's. I shouldn't be saying this, but one of the highlights was, big important parade, particularly when you are leaving, and marching to a band, and I can see how hypnotic it can become. Training does make you fit, what you think is a good service, mainly for defense. But in Germany, of course, Hitler was using the same feeling to promote Germany's interest.
What do you think about a 2-year compulsory service, as they did in Israel or still do in Israel? Not necessarily military.
Well, yes, I think that could be one of the things that impressed me, and certainly when I was in China, was the Chinese military. You've got floods on the Yangtze, and the army was out there working in, to protect people and, make sure they could cope with what was going on. The military, let's call it national service, is very good. I do question the length of it. I benefited in many ways from going on the full 2 years, but even then, at the end, I felt it had been a bit too long. And I'm sure those who went to something which was less interesting, the artillery was a very interesting place to be. Surveying, driving. Yes, as soon as I was an officer, I was required to learn. I hadn't got my driving license, and the regiment had somebody who was, he was a senior NCO, who had training, and he could test for advanced driving. And I remember he drove me around the country. I drove him around the country, and there was a point where he said, yeah, it's off you can pass, that's it. I never did a driving test. But he was the authority and could decide. One of the many incidental benefits that came my way.
David.
It sounded as though you were, as you were describing it, as though you were describing more your training than the actual service. But did you cover the whole period, or was there a time when you completed your training and you went somewhere?
No, that's what I say. At the end of 10 weeks, everybody scattered to places where they were required. Yeah. I went on this officer training, which I didn't do very well at. But then I was posted to a regiment. They were based at the time in Carlisle, but they had just returned from holding the peace in Cyprus, keeping Turks and Greeks from, killing each other. And they were about to be equipped with nuclear rockets. I joined them at this point, and we went to Germany, where we were given equipment by the Americans, who insisted on holding the nuclear warheads in a special little camp of their own. But it meant that certainly at the officer level, we were often mixing together with the American officers. It involved quite a lot of very interesting and demanding works. I knew when we went to Germany and had to re-equip ourselves, and by that time I got on well with the guy who ran the motor part of it, equipment, and I remember driving halfway across Germany with some soldiers to the big depot in West Germany, where we were to pick up 152, I remember the number, different things, from launchers down to motorbikes, and driving in charge of 150 vehicles across Germany was great fun, even though it was with nuclear warheads. But I have to say, and this is personal, that one of my learning times in I haven't mentioned this either, and one of my learning times in with this regiment was that most of the senior men I met, the officers and NC officers, STO, were very responsible. And I remember one day we were out with my little troop with 6 think 6 soldiers and a sergeant with me, and we took our launcher. The Americans had supplied us with, we didn't know whether it was a concrete warhead for practice or a nuclear bomb. And we sat there, we set it up, ready to fire, and my sergeant and I sat next to the thing, waiting for the message. The others went off to in somewhere where they feel more secure from a blast. And the sergeant started talking and saying he was really wondering how he felt about this business of, he said, it's one thing if you see somebody coming at you, going to kill you, he had no gumption about, but he said this, it really concerned him that what he was doing, he'd no idea of the damage it was doing to the others. Although these rocket launchers were only for military use, aiming at a military area and not at a civilian area. But he was there very concerned about this. It was really worrying him. And there was another occasion, funny how things happen. I was in London at the time, working there, and it was New Year's Day, New Year's Eve. And in London, New Year's Eve in London becomes a big thing. Everybody goes out and, into the crowds and has fun. What you do once, the New Year's thing, is another matter. I was teaching, and I happened at the time, one of my students had been appointed, having left her school, had been appointed as the youngest publican in the country, the William IV in Windsor. So I knew the family very well by the time this came up, and I phoned the father who was there. I said, do you mind if I come over, join you for this New Year and, see what we do? And I did it. And I went over there, and the father and his son were dishing out the beer. I was there to keep the natives happy. And there was standing beside me at the bar this very silent man. And we were chatting, a few of us there, and came the New Year, and this guy turned to us and said, would you make a toast with me? And so 3 or 4 of us did this, and he said, let's just drink to those in the army who'll be killed trying to keep the Catholics and the Protestants from killing each other. Dead silence all around. It was a time that there was bombing in London, and the father came over to me, and the lad's father came and said, look, see if you can keep this guy out of or get him. But I started talking to him, and I said, yes, sir, are you in the army? He said, yes. And I said, what? He said he'd been sent on leave, because just a week ago, he was a sergeant. And just a week ago, he'd been leading a troop through, one of those awful areas with and he said he was at the front of the troop, and at the back was his great friend, less, maybe another sergeant, I suppose. And he said, while we were going round, my friend, who was a Catholic, was shot in the back by another Catholic. And he said, I'm on leave. And I said, oh, you're in the army. What are you? I said, they're all artillery. Oh, I said, what battery? 19 battery. I said, because it's a few years old, I said, did you know Sergeant Parrish, my sergeant? He said, no, I was with Sergeant Clark, who was the opposite. There were 2 of us in the battery. And it was the way he spoke about his time that really impressed me. Again, he'd learned that his responsibility was a pacific one rather than aggressive.
Angela.
Going back to the idea of national service, when I lived and worked in Botswana for 3 years at Tinoto College of Education, and at the time, Botswana had a scheme of national service for 18-year-old students. Don't forget, Botswana does peace, it does not do war. And some of our students had been in schools for a certain amount. It was mostly for in hospitals and in schools, so that the students would help overcome skill shortages and actually learn a little bit on the job before going to train, you know, in the case of Tanoto, at a college of education. I mean, in terms of us as teachers going to Tanoto College of Education, I came back in 2000. Our role was to introduce modern methods of teaching. Now, the students who came to us had worked in schools where if you didn't get the right answer immediately, you were likely to be hit around the face or whatever. We didn't teach methods like that. And so, in a way, the students that came to us that had done the national service, depending on whether they'd been in a primary school or a secondary school, actually had to undo a lot of learning that they'd got in their national service in Botswana. But yeah, Botswana is a wonderful country to live and work in, and it is peaceful, it doesn't do war. And I think that's quite good for Quakers to know that, perhaps go on holiday there.
Are you in touch with any of the people you knew within the National Service these days, Gordon?
Not now, no. You know, life went on. My grandchildren were being born, and then I started to, you know, first of all I got part-time contracts after Botswana in Jordan, and then of course there was that nasty war. I was only there for a month at a time. I mean, what happened, I understand, when the war actually broke out, British Council, British Embassy, Uncle Tom Cobley and all marched into where my colleague was actually teaching and simply said to him, "Your plane leaves in 2 hours. We are taking you back to your hotel and you are going now." Almost mid-sentence. I mean, the British government will protect you when war is called. But that was, Jordan is another amazing country. I mean, it has so many refugees now, it's unbelievable. You know, you can't get, just awful. But it was a very interesting country to go, and they were upgrading their whole school system, starting with kindergarten. And I'm basically I'm an infant teacher. My expertise is young children. And what they were doing was wonderful. Absolutely. Well, I don't know what it's like now, because they don't have oil, so they don't have any money. They wanted an educated workforce. So, yeah, so national service is interesting, worthwhile.
What about you, Gordon?
Throughout me.
Do you know any more about any of the people you were with?
No. I was visited once after I left by somebody who'd come back to this country to get married or something like that. But apart from that, I think the general feeling of the permanent, you know, full-time soldiers was a bit sniffy about national service. Yeah.
David?
Yeah, Gordon, you sort of cut yourself off at the end when you were starting to talk about kind of office work or something like that, or and it sounded as though you could talk more on that, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
I could. I don't know what relevance it would be to think of the national service as a whole, but for me, not always, but sometimes you did some very interesting things. I mean, as I say, getting to Germany, you know, we still had a lot of vehicles with us, and most of the officers traveled by train with most of the soldiers. But the trucks had to be driven across, and the two youngest officers were in charge of, I was in charge of the trucks, and the other guy was in charge of the you know, Champs, the Land Rover sort of car vehicle. So I set off with 18 of these, had to find my way down to Tilbury. We crossed over to Antwerp, we had to find the local military man who would see us onto the motorway, the Autobahn, and I took it all the way to the top. The other guy set off with 30 of these little vehicles, and he was going the same way. But while I'd got to the end, people became concerned because they didn't hear from the other chap at all. And eventually we got a message from the Americans saying that they'd found a convoy of cars traveling through the American zone, which was in the far south, and were they ours? So I had to go and pick them up. And what had happened was the guy had gone up. He didn't have so much in the way of motorways at the time, if any. He drove under the motorway. He knew he had to turn left, but on the other side, left was the wrong direction. So he took all the vehicles down and just went on and on and on until the Americans stopped him.
You're going the wrong way, sir.
Yes. Yeah.
Strange.
What parts of Germany were you in?
A place called Paderborn, which is fairly near the East Germany boundary. And we moved into a German camp, in many ways far better equipped than ours had been, or what we'd seen of ours. And a lot went on. I mean, incidental things. My colonel wanted all his officers to know how to sail, so we all went down to the Mersey, which was the one that they bombed, and sailed there at times. And he also wanted us to learn to ski, so we also went. I didn't get very far with that, but and I did get a holiday with the army had requisitioned a big yacht that the Germans owned and had been in the 1936 Olympics, I think it was. And it was there for hire. And so I had a holiday with some other military. It was Colonel Lucky Woods, who owned the South, who'd been in charge of the South Waziristan Scouts. And first thing he did when we got into the boat was unload all the ballast and filled the bottom with crates of whiskey for general consumption. This is, by the way,
sounds reasonable. Sit on your boat with a nice whiskey.
But I had to learn how to survey. The army boat, we had to survey. We had to be very clear about where we were and the target was. And our trainer would maintain we were better than the Ordnance Survey, more precise. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff.
Yeah. Paddy, speak to me.
Yeah, and like David, you spent quite a bit. Well, it seemed to be quite a bit on the training. But overall, compare the length of time you trained and the length of time you served. How long did you serve for in the end?
Well, there was the training to be an officer in between, and I don't think I served much more than a year, if that. Even then, I felt by the end I was a bit surplus to requirements. As for something less complicated than the artillery than infantry, I think they had some ground for feeling that was too long, and maybe it could have been 6 months or even a year shorter, but still do what was needed at the time. And if there are any attempts to replace national service, which would be without the constraints that the army could apply to you, it's only the first 10 weeks that really might have general application, getting you into shape to take whatever it was. After that, for me, it was very much an individual experience.
At that time, I remember a few American friends who joined a thing called the Peace Corps,
Oh,
which
yes.
was they say they had interesting times, but kind of Americans' idea of being, I think, the world policeman comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, I think that was true of England, well, Britain at the time, United Kingdom. We were there. The colonies, more often than not, were acquired accidentally. Traders falling out with the locals and needed protecting, and India becomes managed by the much smaller country.
Initially, India became managed by a business, didn't they? The East India Company, and then there were various wars. So, but it really was a business interest.
Yes. Any other questions or comments, friends? David?
The obvious one, I remember, it was still just about some kind of possibility as I was growing up. And I remember being quite relieved to not do national service, but I have a tendency to think, maybe I actually did miss out, and it would have been interesting and character building and all the rest of it to have gone through it. And it's really interesting to hear your story, Gordon. So thank you.
Yes, I think we all echo that, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right then, folks.
Thank you
Next
very
week.
much. Yeah. Sorry, Vic.
That's of course, really thanks, Gordon. There's a new perspective on something which I'd heard about from my brother, but not from anybody else.
Yeah, thank you.
Next week, friends, we have again Jenny Joseph. Will she come to the end of her lifestyle by next week? Jenny's title next week is Social Services and Bristol City Council. So do be here and tell your friends to come and listen to Jenny, who is really worth spending the hour with.
She's inspirational, isn't she?
She certainly is that.
Great. Yeah.
Thought-provoking.
Very entertaining.
Good.
Well, good afternoon, friends, and we will see each other again, no doubt.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Gordon.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where do I switch off?